I love the ocean. The soothing sound of the waves, the smells, the feel of the sand beneath my feet. I spent a lot of time at the ocean as a kid, looking for shells, turning over rocks to find crabs, eels, and other sea creatures, as well as swimming in the sea. I became quite skilled at jumping from rock to rock, even though they were slippery, and exploring the sea life on the rocks. And I'd spend hours staring into tide pools. So when there's a game about exploring the sea, immediately I'm intrigued. Because of this, the game Under the Waves caught my eye. Under the Waves is a fun, thought-provoking game by the indie team at Parallel Studio, and published by Quantic Dreams. It's a game dripping with atmosphere, and a feeling of loneliness, despite the presence of more than one speaking character in the story. You don't have to have played it to understand this video, although it wouldn't hurt, and it's a fun game to play.
Base to Capsule 12. Capsule 12, come in. You there, Stan?
I'm sorry. Who is this?
Ah, there he is.
Why, if I'd known the big man himself was running my orientation, I'd have put a tie on.
Ah, there's gratitude for you. The finest in unitrench deep sea fashion, and he talks about dressing up.
How you doing, old man?
Old indeed, but fine. Glad to have you back.
Yeah, well, you're probably the only one.
I'll try not to directly spoil any major plot points in the analysis, but I will spoil some details and some themes. So if you want to play the game completely fresh, I recommend playing it first. This isn't a review of the game, though I have one of those on my channel as well. This is more of an analysis of the feel of the game. Under the Waves follows Stanley, or Stan for short, as he carries out a job for the oil company Unitrench at the bottom of the sea. There, he speaks to his friend and boss Tim remotely. A cool thing about the game is it has some retro-futuristic vibes, like the Fallout games, but referencing a future according to the 1970s. I played Under the Waves thinking it would be a cool sea adventure game, and it was. But when I started to play it, I started to feel an eerily familiar and uncomfortable feeling. It was that sting of recognition of familiarity. I'd felt this way before. Maybe we all have. Under the Waves is a game where you feel the character's isolation under the sea. The feeling of isolation and stewing on the past, while going through scheduled activities, alone, only with a disembodied voice for company. As well as some animals, Joe the sea lion being a standout example, reminded me of the shared traumatic experience of COVID lockdown. This big, heavy thing that we don't really like to talk about right now. But it makes sense it would subconsciously come out in an art piece such as this one. I should be clear, I don't know when this game was first formulated as an idea, but it definitely has vibes that remind me of the lockdown that much of the world lived through. I also understand that it's hard to populate games with lots of people, so I might be projecting here. There are many games about isolation, loneliness, and all that have a very isolating feeling, like Subnautica, Alien Isolation, Firewatch, My House, Portal, Dead Space, Silent Hill, to name a small few. And these weren't necessarily about COVID. In fact, most of them were made before COVID. And many people have had a feeling of isolation before the COVID lockdown. Modern society and technology can cause a feeling of isolation. social media and smartphones have obviously not helped the situation. Let's jump in time for a second to the 1800s. The year was 1809, in a town near the border of England and Wales. It was winter, February 12th to be exact. A baby was born. His name was Charles Darwin. Growing up, he spent time reading under his dining table at home and watching birds that lived in town. He was also indifferent towards school. Years later, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace both discovered the theory of evolution. They came to it around the same time, though the theory is widely attributed to Darwin. Somewhat like Newton and Leibniz, and the discovery of calculus. One of the big reasons Darwin's name is slapped on evolution is because of his excellent book, The Origin of Species. This theory of evolution these men discovered is elegant and beautiful, and it's the only real way to make sense of the wonders of life we see around us. But it can be used to make a lot of wild claims that are hard to prove or unprovable, made by pseudoscientists. And that's what I'd like to do here. It is very likely, though unprovable, that human beings have evolved a need to be a part of the social tribe. We have likely evolved an aversion to isolation. Isolation would have only been a situation in hunter-gatherer times that would happen to an outcast from the tribe. And being an outcast could, more often than not, mean death or the inability to reproduce. Thus, individuals fearful of this possibility would be selected for an evolution. It may be the source of a lot of our social anxieties. Embarrassing oneself in public can be terrifying for many. For example, a large percentage of people are terrified by public speaking. There are a lot of people who are afraid of talking to someone they have feelings for, due to the fear of rejection. And many folks just have these general social anxieties. The vast majority of people can probably relate to these things to some degree, including myself. At least depending on what mood you're in. So of course we don't like to be isolated. Though it can be nice if you want to read a book or something. I would say, in regards to trauma, isolation makes trauma feel worse and more intense. We stew on the past, which likely caused many of the mental issues we saw during COVID. It's also harder to move on from things when new social things aren't happening and you aren't discussing things with other people. Sometimes men in particular have trouble sharing their feelings with others due to both an inability to properly express emotions and the cultural taboo on men being emotional. All humans that have left the womb, regardless of gender, have dealt with some trauma in the past. And trauma is a hard thing for everyone. We all had to frickin' cope with the pandemic in our own way. And children were probably the least ready to do so because they didn't have fleshed out coping mechanisms. So we're going to still see the fallout of this isolation in the future. Many people got animals for company. Joe the sea lion in Under the Waves reminds me of one of these animals. The creeping feeling of isolation, despite some contact with the outer world, can be felt in this game. Stan, the main character from this story, is living with a trauma, and is only exacerbated by his loneliness. His only friends and family are disembodied voices. These nightmares manifest as creatures in the dark. At least that's the way I interpreted it. His pain becomes these terrifying creatures, and every night he suffers from intense nightmares. This kind of stress from trauma can manifest in many ways in the body. Anxiety, nightmares, sleep paralysis, chronic pain, depression, perseveration, nervous tics, digestive system pain, skin problems, social anxiety. The list goes on. This story was acting out a catharsis of sorts, and that's what makes it so beautiful. We've all suffered. We all suffered during COVID. Even if you weren't locked down, there was some stress involved. I think this game is an interesting and beautiful metaphor for this suffering. Let's talk about catharsis. I'm no expert, but a simple Google search reveals that catharsis is the process of releasing and thereby providing relief from strong or repressed emotions. I mean, that's what I found on Google. And how do you achieve this process? That's not really well defined. This story was an example of catharsis. Reliving the whole trauma put Stan in a position to reunite with his wife Emma. This is what made it a powerful experience. You can live in your suffering and accept the delusion as your new reality. You can move on with your life and live with the pain every day. Or you can find some catharsis, so you're at peace with it. Stan was living with the trauma of losing a child, and for many that would be the most intense trauma you could live with. He needed some catharsis. I think this catharsis could be found through discussing the pain, reliving it again in some way with a healthy outcome at the end, and ultimately letting go of the circle of neural connections that someone can get stuck in. There are likely multiple ways to achieve this process. Human beings are social animals, and we need people to talk to and connect with to feel well. We don't need 1,000 people, but we need some that we can truly talk to. And being part of a community is desired by most people. Feeling like part of a community. Pretty much everyone desires that. Sometimes one person who we can really talk to about things is enough. And that was one of the really important messages I found in this game, at least for me personally. And that's why I think the story was so powerful. Needless to say, though I'll say it anyways, I thought this was a really thought-provoking game. Even without getting into pollution, environmental destruction, oil drilling, and global warming and climate change aspects of the story. It reminded me of the importance of being present and connected, and how not having that was so difficult. And there were so many people who suffered during COVID, and those who suffered the most were likely the most impoverished to begin with. And I look forward to what art can come out of this traumatic experience that the world went through. Because sometimes beautiful things come from dark places. Thanks for listening.